All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome back to Know Who Drives Return. I'm David Drapkin along with Joanna Macris. Today, we're delighted to have on Chris Beals, who's the CEO of WM Technology. You might know them better as Weedmaps, the parent. The parent company of Weedmaps. Newly public, been public for about a year, having gone through a deSPAC process. Super excited to talk to Chris about cannabis, technology, the regulatory environment. Maybe even get into SPACs because that's near and dear to my heart. So first, Chris, thanks so much for taking the time and excited to talk to you today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It's great to be here.
All right, so how about a quick introduction to who is Chris? Maybe a little bit of background on yourself, how you came to the cannabis industry.
Yeah, so I've been the CEO of the company for about 3.5 years now. And the company itself is quite old. We're a 14-year-old company. We've been profitable our entire history, which was to some degree both a byproduct of frugality, but also of the fact that obviously it was difficult, even as a cannabis technology and data provider, to get funding into the technology space that was adjacent to cannabis. But at this point, I'm a lawyer by training, who then like so many lawyers, made the sojourn into doing finance and doing startup and technology advisory work. But in terms of the company, it's really split into two pieces. So under WM Technology, one side is Weedmaps, or the Weedmaps marketplace. So it's the largest online e-commerce marketplace for cannabis, I think worldwide. We operate both in the US and all 37 states that are legal, as well as internationally in legalized jurisdictions, think Canada and places like that. And then the other part of it is a sort of think Shopify and Salesforce set of business tools or SaaS solutions that go along with the marketplace. So that is in-store menuing, online e-commerce tools and embeds to power e-commerce on your own website as a retailer or brand, CRM solutions, delivery logistics, which is really difficult in cannabis, where it generally has to be done only by employees. And there are things like real-time GPS tracking that's required, signature manifest, stuff like that. But so when you think about, well, what's the unifying theme between the two is, between the marketplace and the SaaS solutions, we are providing a spectrum of solutions that cover the customer lifecycle, from acquiring a new consumer, getting them to come in, look at your products, shop, check out, and buy, being able to fulfill it. And in cannabis, the really key part is fulfill it compliantly with reporting, with the delivery tracking, with making sure that you're providing the requisite information each of these states require. And then customer reacquisition, getting whether it be that same person or that person maybe you ordered a couple months ago and hasn't been in a while, to come back into the commerce lifecycle and order ideally from your brand or retail shop.
Yeah. Why don't we dive a little bit into some of the important distinctions between the two businesses? In the B2C component, you mentioned the listing service. I think a lot of people might also think of Leafly, which comes to mind. So maybe, talk a little bit about kind of distinguishing elements of that piece of the business to start.
Yeah, so we've always been very focused on shopping, on the actual marketplace piece. And there's a lot of data science and POS integration that goes into normalizing inventory data across all these point of sale systems and matching like product to like product. Traditionally, and so the closest non-endemic analogy to that would essentially be Amazon. But if you look at, say, the alcohol delivery space, most of the alcohol delivery companies like Drizzly and that sort of thing couldn't overcome this issue. And so they solved it by doing central depoting and taking possession of product. We don't want to do that, and we're solving it via data and technology. When you look at Leafly, they traditionally came at it as a strains database and as a news site. And so I think they're a little bit later to trying to do the marketplace side of things, but still, I believe most of their traffic is not sort of shopping intended traffic. It's traffic coming to learn or read strain or news or that sort of thing. Whereas you look at our site, it's the other way around. Over 90% of people coming to the site are looking to shop or try and purchase cannabis. But the key difference also is that like other segments, the key consumer is regular consumers. So people and in cannabis, we define that as someone who, say, consumes once a month or more. So over 90% of our users report consuming cannabis once a month or more. And in fact, over 70% report consuming daily. So ultra frequent consumers. This is the backbone. This is the high order sizes. This is what not only drives revenue for these businesses, but frankly is critical for them achieving positive profit margins.
Yeah. I just find it fascinating that, you're essentially in the early stages of building a market, right? And from a B2C perspective, or sorry, B2B perspective, you have to integrate lots of disparate states that have their own POS systems. You're trying to create some sort of uniformity or compliance, I would imagine, like across providers. Like how does that work? And what are some of the hooks that the software provides right now to the customer?
So one of the interesting things is for specialty goods, specialty marketplaces dominate. The more complex the good, the more consumers need a specialized shopping experience, whether it be helping with recommendations, whether it be helping to make sense of the information they're being presented, that sort of thing. If you take something like the consumer tire industry, over $40 billion industry last year, when it comes to e-commerce, overwhelmingly dominated by sites, marketplaces that are specific to tires. And tires are, I would posit, 100 times more simple than cannabis, which has a wide variety of clinical effects, a wide variety of form factors. There's new product lines, form factors, cannabinoids, think THC and CBD and their subvariants, that seem to be coming out all the time. And so we're really in the early acceleration phase of the complexity of the product. And already it's far more complex than anything else out there, plus you consume it. And so a lot of what we've been focused on in the marketplace and what's so critical is how do you recommend the right product to the right person? Or how do you help a consumer sort through all of this dizzying choice and select what's going to work for them, especially when you consider that we're in a potentially pre-recessionary period and people care a little bit more about what they're spending on. And so that's really where we spend a lot of time, like most marketplaces out there, where we've been relentlessly focused on not necessarily consumers coming to the site, but what's the conversion? How many people coming to the site are buying products? And where you see that manifest is over the last couple of years, we've several-fold increased the conversion rate of consumers coming to the marketplace, but we also look at, for businesses that choose to promote their products or appear more prominently in front of consumers, what's the return on that spend in terms of actual hard conversion for people coming in and buying their product? And so that's really been the focus of what we've done. And on the flip side of that, to surface all of that information up, we're constantly diving deeper with the point of sale providers, with brand catalogs. So we do something where when we take sort of fairly naked point of sale data, we'll try and fuzzy match or use machine learning to match it to known products or known reviews, and then hydrate it with normalized brand information that helps educate consumers, build trust, that sort of thing. So I've probably gotten a little too far deep into the data science that sits behind it, but really what we're doing is making, frankly, a really complex, sometimes daunting sort of product approachable enough to consumers that they're comfortable buying in an online setup.
Yeah. I mean, I imagine you have an incredible amount of information available in terms of like customers' purchasing patterns, and how does the federal illegality of this market affect your ability to, I guess, hook into some of the data analytics?
Well, so I think we have more first-party data than anyone else out there, and first-party data sort of become trendy for a lot of online marketplaces, trying to get to that sort of how do you both recommend products, but then potentially how do you help merchandisers know what products to sell or in what quantum to carry them. And so we have, at this point, almost 14 years of first-party data, which is really incredible. I think on the federal side, the main way that federal illegality or federal prohibition impacts us is all of the models that look at leveraging first-party data generally at some point involve a take rate, a percentage fee by generating sales that wouldn't otherwise exist without you putting the right product in front of the right consumer. We, have it, like I mentioned, this monstrous cannabis online marketplace. We can't put payment rails in. We can't charge a percentage fee on any transaction, even for Rails enablement. We can't charge an incremental fee for matching a consumer with a product that they otherwise wouldn't purchase. And so I'd say when people look at our revenue growth and sort of where we sit, and then think about that vis-a-vis federal illegality, I mean, there's I would say that, like the iceberg analogy, the mountain of sort of the forward revenue growth and that sort of thing, I think really sits on the other side of federal prohibition. And conversely, the complexity, the difficulty, the barriers to entry from state by state regulation, or the complexity of the product stays the same after federal legalization. And so I really like that setup. I think it's one of the really attractive things around this story is if you like it now, you're going to like it 8 times as much or 80% more when federal legalization comes. Again, continuing the iceberg analogy.
Right. What about thinking about the high percentage of the market that's still kind of illicit sales, right? And I think you've talked a lot in the past about, states aren't issuing enough licenses. How is that, I guess, what's the snapshot of the situation currently and how could that change over time?
Yeah, so I think the one thing to understand with cannabis is, whether a state legalizes or doesn't, the number of people consuming cannabis stays relatively the same. So about 12 or 13% of the population consumes cannabis on a monthly cadence, and that stays the same when a state goes from being prohibition to legal. But the thing is that consumers generally are willing to put up for safe, legal, lab-tested products, are willing to jump over a fair amount of hurdles. But where you start to run into an issue is when they have to drive too far to get to cannabis products. So that gets to the retail density point. And so, for instance, and that's what's led to this factor where, again, I think while legal cannabis sales have grown, I think it was estimated about 25 billion last year. I think the illicit cannabis market was probably well over 60 or 65 estimated last year. And so the thing there is that increasing license density helps, but it's also regulators realizing that when you look at a state like California, probably about 75% of cannabis demand in California, although it's a very robust market, is met on the illicit side. Mm-hmm. Not coincidentally, or I should say, in the same token, about 75% of California cities and counties don't allow cannabis licensing currently. If you are sitting in Bakersfield, I think you probably have to drive about 2 hours to get to the nearest licensed cannabis dispensary. People don't do that.
What's the primary obstacle at the state? Like, why are states not issuing licenses?
Sorry,
sorry. What are some of the primary obstacles, like in terms of getting the license? The amount of licensing up.
The biggest thing is it's frankly it's local control and NIMBYism, or not in my backyard, and so it's educating local regulators and/or, as we've seen some states do, frankly, just eliminating local control. If you look at the state of Oklahoma, which has one of the highest cannabis license densities of any state per capita, it's because they don't allow local governments to restrict cannabis licensing. And I think there's been an increasing amount of both sticks and carrots that state governments are putting in to try and urge cities to move forward. So, for instance, in California, the budget that's the budget bill that's sitting in front of the governor right now has a grant program where there will be grants to cities to move forward with cannabis licensing. I think we've seen in other places states say, well, out of the state general cannabis fund, tax fund, you can't be apportioned and receive tax funds unless you've opted in and decided to move forward with licensing. But also we're seeing, as a factor of time, mindsets kind of change. So if you look at New York, which just is in the early stage of moving forward with adult use legalization, over 50% of cities in New York opted into retail, and many of them also opted into allowing consumption lounges. And so we're seeing this changing perception where cities realize cannabis licensing within my jurisdiction is a good generator of high value jobs. It's a good generator of tax base. It is associated with a reduction in crime rates. It's associated with an increase in real estate rates in the vicinity of that licensing. What local official, if they're presented with those facts, doesn't want that? And so I think part of it is an education thing.
Yeah. And it feels very much like it's an early land grab in terms of, you're kind of out in the market educating, your customers that, you exist, you can make payment processing easier, you make life easier. Kind of what is the go-to-market in terms of, expanding and growing the customer base on the business side?
Yeah, so the playbook varies. It's a somewhat normalized playbook, but it varies based on the maturity and the shape of the state. So if it's a medical state, it may be different than an adult use state. But there's a pretty, one thing that's interesting is there's a pretty clear delineation between how we think about consumer marketing and consumer acquisition and business marketing and business acquisition. And so if you look at the consumer side, the top 3 things that a consumer shop on are price sensitivity, THC or cannabinoid percentage, and 3 is clinical effect. So it gets pretty nuanced pretty quickly. And if you can say to the consumers, we're the best way to help you find, search for cannabis, find the most, or the best price cannabis for your price point, that's really compelling. And it's a heavy consumer focus. And on the business side, it's pointing out, hey, we're driving on average a 5 to 8x ROAS, or return on ad spend, if you want to sort of market to people. Hey, we have software that can help you manage the entire customer acquisition lifecycle. You have one shop, great. You have 5 shops, we scalably can handle that for you, because that's tough as a number of these stores realize you need multiple locations to deal with the increasing number of licenses to really have like to decrease your fixed costs across a broader store footprint. And so, a lot of in the early stages is education. Here's what we offer as a market starts to open. And then as it gets more mature and people become a bit more seasoned, both on the consumer and the business side, it's giving them more detailed use cases, or starting to hit consumers with personalized recommendations of, hey, you bought this before, here's something you should do. Or by the way, people who shop on Weedmaps save on average X% in your state. If you like price savings, come here. And on the business side, as the market matures, then you start to get into case studies. Hey, we're powering delivery using our logistics software for this operator who saw an XYZ increase in their customer reach and in their store economics and that sort of thing.
Yeah. If you take cannabis out of the equation, you are a SaaS company in many ways. And that, includes a really attractive kind of recurring revenue profile, tend to have high margins. You guys reported a strong quarter and guided to, I think, 30% revenue growth, which is very unusual in the current market for companies to be kind of guiding to that kind of growth. Just talk to us a little bit about kind of the demand drivers, like what's driving it, and what you see as kind of long-term profitability, what this business looks like over the long term.
Yeah, so I'll start with the one thing that's really important in this market, which is profitability. We've been profitable 14 years. We're guiding the market towards continuing that streak of profitability this year. It's something that that kind of frugality and looking for ROI, or what's the payback period on anything we deploy money on, is sort of just core to our nature. It comes from having effectively been a bootstrap company until we decided to go public. It's just built into our DNA. And so I think that's important, especially now where on the technology side of things, you're seeing institutional investors have a reset in sort of the expectation of profitability, and also the immediacy of when companies should be profitable, which plays really well to our favor. In terms of the growth, we've guided towards about mid 30% growth this year. I think that's several things. I think one, when you look at that 5 to 8x ROAS, we're still driving unnaturally large returns to clients who choose to promote themselves in the marketplace. We're also continuing to increase the number of orders and transactions happening in the marketplace. And then you have the macro lens that already this year you've had New Mexico, Montana open up for legalization. In New Mexico, that's for all intents and purposes an unlimited license state. You have New Jersey inching out of the gate with allowing some of the incumbent operators to sell cannabis, but that the doors should open wide on that. There were just Senate hearings around that. And then in New York, I think New York is going to open with a robustness and vigor that matches any state opening post legalization in the past. But that being said, a lot of our growth is not really hinging on New York, New Jersey, that sort of thing. It's hinging on the states that have already opened. It has to do with historically the growth that we've driven, that outsized ROAS that we're driving, that frankly means that as businesses are looking to protect margin, grow revenue, I believe we're by far the most cost-effective way to do that, which plays well in a potentially recessionary period. And then the other thing is we've really meaningfully added to that SaaS portfolio, and we're stitching it together with some cool solutions, in-store ordering kiosks. We have something we just launched into beta, which lets businesses using our CRM solution, as opposed to just messaging consumers on email, text, things like that, now directly hit within the Weedmaps marketplace, targeted messages to consumers who follow brands, who follow particular retailers, that sort of thing. And that's going to follow with kind of cohort segmentation, where they can message cohorts of users, people who consume in this region concentrate products or flower products or that sort of thing. And there aren't really power tools like that exist out there. And then another big piece is brands have represented single-digit percentage a single-digit percentage portion of our revenue. Huge opportunity there, and we've actually just launched into beta a number of things for brands where we have deep relationships, but we haven't offered things like embeds on their site to help power retail and product finders and data and analytics offerings. And also, as we see brands try and reach into more states, our platform is, again, I think probably the best way to have sort of that tip of the spear entry in to start educating consumers that, surprise, XYZ brand is now here.
How involved are you guys on the regulatory side in terms of lobbying or working with various states or other entities that are mulling legalization?
So we do a lot of that. I think we've quietly built probably the most efficacious policy team out there for cannabis issues, and we did it with a focus on transparency. We publish our positions on things. We publish all of our white papers, but then also that we come at it using data. That team really has had its origin as early as when I joined the company. And so we've been active in a number of these state and local governments. We work with the National Conference of State Legislatures and others, making recommendations of what good cannabis legalization looks like and what the data looks like on other states that have opened, whether that be good or bad. Because I think ultimately, the main thing holding back cannabis legalization or more widespread adoption of licensing is just lack of understanding of sort of the benefits that it brings, and the fact that most of the purported harms it brings are frankly propaganda that came out of the war on drugs and a lot of money that Nancy Reagan earmarked starting in the 80s. And so, but it is important both on helping jurisdictions legalize and open up. That obviously increases our aperture, our TAM for doing things, but also we have to build a lot of those laws and regulations back into the software. And so knowing, for instance, in Massachusetts, here's the requirement with body cam footage, which they do require for delivery in Massachusetts, being able to talk to our logistics team, should we natively be the ones who support the holding of that body cam footage? Or is there other software that can do that? Or certain states saying, well, we want to have warnings or disclaimers on products. Okay, well, we can auto append that into brand product descriptions. And so there's really a full cycle where that policy team is getting feedback from the business of sort of where they're seeing inefficiency in marketplaces. But conversely, that policy team is telling our product and design team, here's what the rules are saying, or here's where they're bending towards, so we can start to build the software to that before it becomes law.
A lot in there. And so are you looking, so you do operate internationally now? Are you looking at other international markets as things change as well?
Yeah, so we earmarked sort of some investment at the beginning of the year for what we viewed as longer term strategic priorities. I think the market really received well that we bucketed that, said exactly what the investment would be, and that it was for out years, not this year. And one of those buckets was internationalization or international growth. And so to that end, I think some of that is, we've, for instance, we've been in Spain for a very long time. It's one of the larger EU cannabis markets, and we have a kind of a well-recognized sort of dominant position there in terms of name recognition and sort of the use of the marketplace. But sort of we're looking at Germany, looking to move forward with more widespread domestic production, as well as a robust adult use or recreational legalized market. You see Mexico kind of slowly wending its way towards getting there, and we're seeing progress. And so a lot of that focus is similar to what we'd see when in the new state. Unlike other industries where when the US opens, here, when every state opens, it's like a new country opening. So again, a lot of the playbook, although the language may be same, the political organization and hierarchy may be different, it's a similar playbook, whether it be New Mexico opening or Germany opening, as strange as that sounds to say.
Right. And so you mentioned earlier, you were bootstrapped effectively, and then you obviously went through the SPAC transaction. So I guess one early reflections as running a public company.
Yeah, I think we've been thinking about the go public for some time. So I think we're a pretty old company. So I think a lot of, from a maturity and readiness viewpoint, I think we were there. Obviously, I think something anyone who makes the jump to the public side of things would say is, it requires a different level of maturity, a different level of precision and exactitude before you make that jump. And also you have to accept the fact that and I think this is why, being profitable is important, but you're going to incur a certain amount of extra overhead or cost by going public. That's just what comes along with it. I think the SPAC side of things is really interesting because I do, as much as I don't, for the life of me, don't understand why this sort of correlation in SPAC trading, given the wide differentiation of the businesses. But I do, I think when I think of why companies, go public via SPAC, I think there's two really strong use cases where it makes sense. One of which we fell into, and the first is if you're going to have to go public and then double step, and you're going to do a material M&A acquisition, and that's why you're raising funds. The DraftKings transaction was an example. Sometimes it's easier just to do the M&A and the go public in one transaction, and I think it's easier to pitch investors on a closed go public and merger than it is to sort of pitch people on a go public followed by a presumptive merger. And then the other reason is when you have a really complex story, I think that's why we've seen a lot of usage of SPAC vehicles by businesses in highly regulated spaces like national defense, things like that. When you have a really complex story, traditional roadshow cadence and the length of time you have with investors can be a real challenge. And when we did early test the waters, one of the things we found is, because we were thinking about a regular way IPO, was we would go in and the cannabis industry was so alien to technology investors, because we were predominantly going after regular way technology investors, that we would spend most of the allotted time explaining how a seed or a clone becomes a product in somebody's hand. And we actually spent talking about, and here's how we overlay a really powerful e-commerce technology and data platform over that industry. That, I think our feeling was that if we did a regular way IPO, we were going to be hampering demand because we just needed more time to educate people on the story. And so when we did the PIPE, which was very well oversubscribed, but part of that was taking a longer period of time to really go back and have multi-hour conversations with groups of investors or large individual investors to explain the story and educate them. And so, I think looking back, I think I would still do it the same way, regardless of sort of the vitriol that's slung at SPACs these days. But again, it's very situation dependent in terms of whether that makes sense for a company or not.
Yeah, I totally agree. And again, I think, a lot of the vitriol is unwarranted. Some is warranted, but as you mentioned, you're a profitable company. It's a different story than some of the, hockey stick growth, crazy stuff that was out there that was getting a lot of the press.
Yeah, I think, look, I think the thing is, like a lot of what we were projecting, look, we could not foresee, there were some pretty material disruptions to the cannabis industry last year, but a lot of what we were, projecting on the go forward and looking at was based on sort of, us taking our best guess at trying to disaggregate what was the COVID effect, because with COVID, a fair amount more people were sort of consuming edibles during the workday, let's just put it that way, and trying to disaggregate what was steady state growth versus COVID-induced growth, which definitely made kind of giving forward projections a little bit tougher. But yeah, I think we were, as you alluded to, we're just fundamentally a different company. We had the optionality. We could have gone out in the fashion that whatever fashion we chose, but it was a matter of how do we get the right people onto the book who we think are going to be long-term shareholders. Right.
No edibles in the workplace over here. So
yeah, it's funny because I do think that in the wake of COVID, there has been a step shift where a lot of people who were sort of reluctant to try cannabis or sort of were nervous about it, where we saw kind of an acceleration of new cannabis consumers who realized, hey, this isn't so bad. Actually, this is actually a good alternative. And also, as we've seen a growth in sort of kind of, especially among millennials, this idea of like teetotalers or people who want to reduce alcohol consumption, cannabis has started to backfill a certain chunk of that because it is, look, there are a lot of different ways you can slice it. Cannabis is far healthier for you than alcohol.
Right. It goes along with, the education bit that you were, talking about earlier, right? So a lot of this is educational. I see parallels to like sports betting and things like that, where, once viewed as like a terrible, illicit, illegal thing, as, the culture around all this stuff changes, that can only mean good things for your business and the prospects.
Well, the other thing is too, and this is what the policy team often say when they say to regulators, they say, listen, what's before you when you open up? And this was the same as sports betting. You don't have a choice between people consuming cannabis or not consuming cannabis. That's the same, and it stayed the same for decades. You have a choice between whether people consume legally purchased safe cannabis or illicitly purchased cannabis. That is the only choice before you right now. And I think the same was very much true in sports betting. You don't have a choice whether people bet on sports. You have a choice whether they do so in a way where they can get help if they're not doing that in a responsible fashion, or in a way where they're dealing with somebody who frankly has no incentive to give them help.
Fair point. Joanne, anything else?
I just thought I would ask you, I mean, to your earlier point, the rise of the psychedelics industry, right? And obviously it's early stages, the administration from a like clinical perspective will be completely different. But I feel like, the proponents of psychedelics very much position this as a clinical market and position marijuana as a recreational use market for the most part. So like, what are your thoughts on that? And B, does the growth of that industry help? Are you friendly? Like, how does that impact your business over time?
Yeah, I think, well, so to throw something out a little bit controversial, and it's not a race, like we don't need to compare, but I will say that I think cannabis is, from a clinical usage and sort of the areas where it looks like it has medical impact, probably has far wider areas of clinical usage than psychedelics. And that's not a knock on psychedelics. I think there's really interesting bodies of research, but look, Harvard has a cannabis medical conference every year, at least they did up until COVID occurred. And there were really interesting studies on usage of cannabis, from things ranging from traumatic brain injury through type 1 diabetes, with mouse studies that were really promising in the early 80s in Israel that the doctor doing them had trouble getting published, to obviously PTSD work. We tried sponsoring some of that, and the researcher was threatened with having some of their other grant funding pulled, to all the normal stuff where you see the prescription and prescription fill rates drop for the traditional treatments, which are things like sleep disorders, pain medications, opioids, anti-anxiety, things like that. So, I think, and there are reasons that I won't go into here why it can have such a wide range of clinical effects, in part because there's 1,000 different compounds at play in cannabis. I think psychedelics will be interesting because I do think there's going to be an element where they start to push the recreational side of psychedelics at some point, but I think there's an intentional sequencing of what they push for and what's going to be least shocking. I think one thing that underpins a lot of cannabis, makes it complex, everything else, is that there's such a wide range of clinical effects. There's such a wide range of compounds. There's such a wide range of consumption modes. And I think with psychedelics, I know that there's a lot of discussion around, different compounds within, for instance, like hallucinogenic mushrooms and things like that. But I think one of the big X factors on psychedelics is going to decide whether it goes into, like, you get a homogenized pill or there's actually a more robust supply chain, is how much the research actually proves out that there's a wide diversity in effects and compounds and that sort of thing on that side of things. The more the diversity, the more the breadth, I think the more you're going to see an SMB dominated state-by-state supply chain business that's really robust, really interesting. And the more you move to single compound, sort of single chemical pathway, the more you may see it kind of like the pharma companies try and horn in and kind of claim it as sort of like a one-dose pill or a time release or something like that. Oh. But I do have to say that it really isn't, between the two, I don't view them as being competitive. I think rethinking our view generally to what's safe, how to take products that are widely used but an illicit market and bring it into a safe legal market, these common themes are why the two, I think, are really in sympathy with each other. And I don't think that one winning or one growing faster will be to the detriment of the other. I think it's like sneakers and socks.
Right. And the method of administration is completely different. It will have to take place in clinics, for example, right? So like, it's hard to imagine an online marketplace for psychedelics at any point in time.
Yeah, yes and no. I'll be honest. I feel like I get a semi tongue-in-cheek inquiry about mushy maps like once a quarter. I think, as you see, it's interesting because I think when you look at the true origins of cannabis legalization in San Francisco in the 80s at the height of the AIDS epidemic, where it was being viewed as really helpful for people who were suffering like the horrible effects of HIV and AIDS. And the city basically saying, yep, it's for medical, and then that opened up other things. I think what you're seeing with some of the state-by-state allowance of psychedelics and cities saying, you know what, we're going to decriminalize it. We're going to take it away. I do think that you're going to see a recreational psychedelics market that emerges where you are going to see stores and things like that. That's my belief. I think it will definitively have a clinical, and you're going in and you're sort of dealing with issues and that sort of thing. But I think there's going to be a distinctly non-clinical thing if we see the same trend carry out that came with the rise of cannabis. I think the one difference is people incorrectly conflate the stage of evolution where psychedelics is at versus cannabis. And people tend to say, oh, well, psychedelics is at 2014 California timeframe. I'm like, no. I think psychedelics is at 1988 California timeframe. It's a massively different time in the evolutionary period. And I think potentially you could see a compression of that timeline moving forward, but by no means is the current state of dialogue and discussion, or I would say that the state of current dialogue and discussion is similar to San Francisco at the height of the AIDS epidemic.
Yeah.
Right. Well, hey, Chris, really appreciate you taking the time today. Awesome conversation, and we'll be sure to keep following the progress. So thanks again.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.